Hi, I'm Roger Ferris, an architect in Westport, Connecticut, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. George Smart recently visited New York City's Architecture and Design Film Festival. While he was there, he ran into Jason Cohn and returning podcast guest Fred Noyes. They talked about their new documentary, Modernism Inc. It's about one of the Harvard Five, Eliot Noyes. We'll also visit with another filmmaker from the Architecture and Design Film Festival, Hans Christian Post. He has a few problems with idyllic Copenhagen in Denmark. And later on, music with North Carolina's legendary bandleader, trumpeter Jim Ketch. And now, your host, who can't play the trumpet, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. I used to be a musician. Years and years of piano lessons in childhood, sprinkled with a disastrous and ear-breaking drum instruction period.
Oh, God.
But by the time all those lessons could have come to mean anything, at age 13, I was out. I gave up after trying to form a band with other teenagers who, to put it kindly, weren't any good either. Although our lead singer, Michelle, was an angel descended from heaven, we only lasted a few months. I was crushed when she drifted off to a very sophisticated ninth grader named Greg.
Aww.
Is it true that straight boys form rock bands just to get the girls? Well, it was for me, and after that, my musical career was over, and all I wanted to do was put on my dad's huge earmuff headphones, which were incredibly expensive, and listen to Chicago or Three Dog Night, which miraculously are still touring today.
They are.
My parents' love of jazz was not on my radar, but they enrolled me with Betsy Hanna, Raleigh's foremost jazz piano teacher, who miraculously 53 years later is still teaching. And she was amazing, but I eventually washed out, ringing the bell on a piano like a Navy SEAL trainee on his last day. That's so often the case, isn't it, when our parents try to pass on something from their generation to the next. As the saying goes, we just aren't that into it. It was years ago in college at UNC Chapel Hill, listening to WUNC Radio, that jazz found me again, this time as a listener, tuning in to Gary Shivers and Carol Sloan on Saturday mornings, going to a little jazz club that only lasted a few years, Stevens After All, owned by past podcast guest Stephen Barefoot, and hanging out at the WUNC radio station to hobnob with jazz musicians at the time of their public radio on-air fundraisers. That phone number, miraculously, after 40 years, still works. 1-800-962-9862. Or if you're calling from Arizona, 1-800-962-YUMA.
Huh.
I am not making this up. So here we are in 2024, and it's come full circle. Despite attempts, my grandchildren have zero interest in jazz. It's hip-hop on YouTube, which will, inevitably, still be around 50 years from now. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle Square Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Jason Cohn is an award-winning writer, producer, and director. His 2019 film, The First Angry Man, was a Ken Burns Prize finalist and a winner of the Los Angeles Press Club Award for Political Documentary. Jason's articles on public affairs and culture have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Rolling Stone. His latest film, Modernism Inc., focuses on the work of Eliot Noyes and was screened at the 2023 Architecture and Design Film Festival in New York. Past podcast guest, architect Fred Noyes, is the son of Eliot Noyes. He's the owner of the family house where he grew up, Noyes House 2. It's the focus of an effort to preserve the house as a public monument to his father's life and career. From the lounge of the Moxie Hotel in New York City, here's George's conversation with Jason Cohn and Fred Noyes.
Jason, I didn't know until recently that you were also the force behind the Eames documentary, The Architect and the Painter. What a splendid film.
Oh, well, thank you.
We showed that in North Carolina 10 years ago.
At what theater?
At the Jim Hunt Library. We were showing it there then. Just a one-time thing.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
And having visited the Eames house myself in California and read on that, we don't appreciate today what a force of nature these two were in so many realms.
Yeah. No, they were, I said in the film that their studio was one of the most creative addresses on the planet, and I stand by that. The number of things that they produced out of that studio.
And the diversity.
The diversity, right. I mean, so there was the architecture, but there was the graphics, and there was the films, and the exhibition design, and the furniture, of course, which is what they're most famous for. But that was almost, at a certain point, that was almost an afterthought for them. I think that what they really cared about was the communications design that they were doing.
And their film, The Powers of 10, was the only film I remember in school growing up that they made us watch multiple times.
Yeah.
Because they wanted us to get something different every time we looked at it.
Which you can.
You really can.
Yeah. I mean, there's the math and the astrophysics, but there's also the design aspect of it, right? I mean, what they were able to do with just optical effects, no computer effects. I mean, it's just such a well thought out production design. It's really an incredible piece of filmmaking. It's in the National Registry, I think, as one of the
most important films.
One of the
ever,
most important
right?
films. Yeah, it's in the Library of Congress or whatever.
What I like about it is the simplicity of concept, which I think is something universal in good design, the simplicity of concept, and then you have all sorts of details or overlays of meanings that you can read from that, rather than having to get into complexities in order to explain what you're about. That just bingo, going right for the jugular.
And that really is one of the hallmarks of great design, is it kind of sneaks up on you, and you don't realize everything that has gone into it. And that's part of one of the themes of your film, Modernism Inc., is how corporations realized that design was a thing and that it was not only a good idea, but it would help sell a lot of product.
That's right.
So how did they discover this?
Well, I think that Tom Watson Jr., who, when he first met Eliot Noyes, was not at that time the chairman of IBM. He was not running it, but his father was, and he was next in line. I think that he was very open to the idea. He wasn't himself an architect or a designer, but he had big eyes. He saw the world. He traveled a lot. And I think that he was just, generally speaking, very open to ideas for what can make his company better. And Eliot Noyes, who I think it's fair to say had a knack for being in the right place at the right time, was able to kind of put on I would say like an education program for Tom Watson Jr.
I would add to that, actually, that it took my father 10 years to persuade Tom Watson that this was something worth doing. That he started out designing a typewriter, which he inherited because of the demise of Dreyfus's office. But then it was the educational aspect that you're talking about. Look, the design is much deeper and much more powerful for IBM than a series of typewriters or a series of miscellaneous stuff. There really has to be a whole organization to make you look like what you are. And right now you look as though you're coming from the 19th century, and you're the only act in town that can, in fact, put astronauts in space.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that he, like Fred says, he worked for a full decade. He had a friendship with Tom Watson Jr., which was started in the Army, or the Air Force, I should say. But he would do all kinds of stuff with him, right? He would bring him to museums, he would bring him to the opera, and he was always kind of whispering in his ear about what he felt design could do for IBM. And I think that, as Fred was saying, the refrain that he was probably repeating all the time is that you have a great company, you make great products, you're way ahead of the curve in terms of technology, but why doesn't it look like that's the company
why
that
doesn't
you
it
are?
match?
Yeah.
Now, was Noyes responsible for the design of the Selectric typewriter?
That's probably his most famous piece of industrial design that he was primarily responsible for the design concept. Like, what people mostly think about with that piece of equipment, of course, is the ball.
Right.
And he didn't design that. That was a piece of intellectual property that IBM had purchased. But the whole ensemble and how it fit together, and the silhouette of the machine, and the way that the keys felt on your finger, and how it all worked together. I mean, making that ball work inside of the frame of the typewriter was not an easy piece of industrial design or engineering.
No.
There's a lot of work that went into that. So it's really a remarkable piece of industrial design, which, I think that's clearly an icon of industrial design. It's something that people associate with Eliot Noyes, but there was a lot of other things that he did, dictation machines and typewriters. He did a lot of industrial design at IBM, aside from sort of the bigger picture planning of sort of building the entire
brand identity part.
Right, the whole building the program, the design program, which involved so many other things besides product design. It involved architecture, it involved advertising and communications and graphic design and so many other things.
So was Noyes the one that made the decision about the color, that this was going to be blue for IBM and that IBM would be known as Big Blue?
I don't think that Eliot was really a color guy. I think that was more Paul Rand who he brought in.
I'm sure it was Paul Rand who made that suggestion. And also the logo, the way the logo worked, that's Paul Rand. Mm-hmm. But my father had the knowledge that other people were better at those particular things, whether it be Paul Rand or Eames or whoever, and so would go to them, the best he could find, and then follow their advice.
Right,
and
I
then
think
he had the eye to know when it was right, so that he would give the sign off.
That's right. I think that's what really makes him so unique, is that he was able to visualize what a corporation-wide design program that integrated all these different aspects, what that would look like and how it would work. He was sufficiently confident in his own abilities, but also free of ego, and able and willing to bring in the best people from all around the world, wherever they were, to do all of these different aspects, right? Paul Rand, who did the graphic design and so many of the posters and the logo type, and helped with color, brought so much brightness and whimsy, which is not something that you would have ever associated with IBM prior. He brought that to IBM. But then you also have, the Charles and Ray Eames and the Eames office, who he brought in to help with exhibition design and all kinds of different kinds of communication work. And then, of course, all the architects we brought in from all over the world.
But in some sense, it goes even deeper, because in order to put a program like that in place means that you had to get all the individual castles, which are always in an organization like that, on board with what you're doing. So, in fact, it took, in a sense, a redesign of the structure of IBM with Tom Watson's approval. It says, look, every time something happens, you have to keep design in mind. You have to understand what your product is going to do against a product of another portion of the corporation. When they come into a showroom, they're next to each other. So there was the sense that design is an integral part of any kind of development going on in the company. That's a huge, huge transition from a company that is normally thinking of simple profits, of hiring expertise off when you think you're going to need it.
Right. I mean, the thing about IBM is it was a very big company. It's not as big as it is now, of course, or at its height in the 1980s, I suppose. But it was a very big company. It was operating in like 19 different countries. They had design centers in India and San Jose and Germany and Japan, I believe. So each of those design centers sort of operated independently from the others. And there was no sense of sort of integrity. There's no sense of everything being unified under a single umbrella, right? So wrangling all of that, I think it shows his sort of diplomatic skills, like his ability to communicate across different kind of strata of the company, because he had to be able to communicate with the designers. He had to be able to communicate with the top management, with the middle management, with the engineers. And he had to be able to get them all on board and have them all see the value of working with each other and what it meant to have IBM reflect a certain character.
It's not as if he did the design or he set up the protocols and listen, everybody has to adhere to these protocols. You know, here are the colors, here are the forms, here are the whatever, and you use them. No, it was more like we are trying to get something that feels as though it's commensurate, each thing to the other. And so it's not that they would look the same, it's just that they look correct together. That gives some individuality and some latitude towards the individual areas.
I think that's true. It wasn't prescriptive in the way that Apple design, for example, is very prescriptive. There's a very specific look, right? I mean, there's a very limited color palette. And
it could be that Apple could do that because Apple was starting absolutely fresh.
Right.
And my father was inheriting this diversity of the miscellaneous countries, each one having its own take. Mm-hmm. So he had that insight to give a certain amount of latitude so that it would look correct without being overbearing.
Right. Otherwise, he would have had to knock everything else, down and start from scratch, which he was not in a position to do.
Well, and also there would probably be a lot of blowback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This was not inconsistent, though, with IBM's whole philosophy, which was to be the sole source for the products they put in place, particularly in the early days with mainframes. That was it. Mm-hmm. You went to IBM to get your computing equipment. And when IBM would show its computers against the competitions, they always looked better. Mm-hmm. They always looked like that they were the future, where the other computers looked like they were computers.
That's right. Yeah, I think that Eliot Noyes was really overlooked figure in the history of computing in terms of what he did to make computers more approachable, to seem just like office equipment, not like this high-tech, super complicated guys in white lab coats kind of stuff with wires sticking out, but just to make it all clean and simple and approachable, not intimidating. It's impossible to imagine computers taking over American or European, Asian office spaces around the world if people like Eliot Noyes hadn't done what they did to simplify, to make the computer be, what we think of now as user-friendly. That was just such a critical part, just the engineering and the computer science isn't enough. You have to have the other part, which is figuring out how to make it so that people aren't terrified of it.
Right. Now, Fred, please tell me, your dad didn't design the IBM PC Junior, did he?
I don't know what the IBM PC Junior is. That a laptop?
No, this was one of the first small desktops with the little chiclet keyboard that came out, and it was a huge failure. But I think he was not working with the company at that point.
So my sense from the archival research is that he was involved in some early prototypes of IBM personal, home computers.
The PC.
Yeah, well, there was something
PC.
called that never made it out. It was called the Castle, and there's some really enticing photographs, which I don't know that a lot of people have seen, but they might have been published in some books, but I came across them. They're these, just this very futuristic kind of 2001 A Space Odyssey looking red, sleek. I don't even see a keyboard with it. I have no idea how the inputs and outputs of it worked, but it was this very sleek piece of equipment. All of the photography for it is, with an attractive woman in a home setting. So it was clearly a home computing device.
Was she spread out on a bear rug like most of those ads were in 1966?
Yeah, so an Eames sofa or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What other companies do you touch on in the film?
A little bit of mobile. He also worked with Westinghouse. Another big company that he worked with a lot, we don't really talk about it, was Cummins Engines.
Diesel.
Diesel engines. But we tell a little bit of the story of working with Mobil. He did a massive redesign of their gas stations in the 1960s. Very important part of Mobil's history.
Now, Fred, since you were on the show last, your wonderful house in New Canaan, Connecticut, that you grew up in, is now under preservation easement. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Congratulations, Fred.
Tell our audience what a preservation easement is.
Well, in our case, the preservation easement simply means that regardless of whatever happens to the house, it gets sold, it gets transferred to future relatives, it can only have a certain number of changes. that they will not be able to fill in the courtyard. They will not be able to paint it green. They will not be able to put a second story on it. They will not be able to do a whole lot of stuff. But at the same time, giving a certain amount of latitude because life changes. And in our case, we figured that the house, the real glory of the house is in the living room and dining room and kitchen in the courtyard, that whole sense of nature moving through the house. But if you wanted to change a wall in the bedroom, you could do that. Or if you wanted to change something.
Upgrade a bathroom or something.
Something like that, yeah, leaving the integrity of the house. So forever on into the future, it's going to remain so that people will be able to see it under what circumstances, who knows, but we'll be able to see it as an important part of history in the development of architecture.
The Noyes House in New Canaan is really one of the most spectacular houses in town. I've gotten a chance to be there with Fred before, several times, and it's really fascinating. And the house is open for tours occasionally. You can go to the website, which is, Fred?
Well, Eliot Noyes Center is what we are developing now, and we are just on the verge of being able to organize that for tours or retreats or whatever. So try that. And
is it EliotNoyesCenter.org?
It's EliotNoyesCenter.com. It's actually, there's a little bit of confusion there, but yes.
Okay, great. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Hans Christian Post became an independent filmmaker in 2014. A graduate of the PhD program in modern culture at the University of Copenhagen, his academic focus is on cultural and urban memory, and he serves as a lecturer at Next and the University of Southern Denmark. Now, most people think of Copenhagen as this very cool, idyllic world capital. I mean, it does have Bjarke Ingels, so what could possibly go wrong? Hans' latest film, Best in the World, was screened at this year's Architecture and Design Film Festival. Once again, from the lounge of the Moxie Hotel in New York City, here's George's conversation with Hans Christian Post.
People who have not been to Copenhagen are really missing something. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. And you go there typically, and you're wowed by how everything kind of works. The transportation works. The airport is functional but not overbearing. You can get around easily. There are water features everywhere. There's a newer part of town called Øresund. Is that how you say it?
Ørsted.
Øresund. Mm-hmm. That is full of very contemporary buildings. There's the older part of town. There's Christiania, where all the hippies hang out and still do to a certain extent. And your film looks into this wonder that is Copenhagen and asks the question is like, are they really doing it right? Is it really the best city in the world? Mm-hmm. What sent you on that journey to ask this question?
Well, first of all, I was living myself in Copenhagen, and I have been for quite some time. I moved to Copenhagen in 92, and of course I also knew the city beforehand in the 70s and 80s. So I've witnessed this transformation that Copenhagen has gone through over the last 30 years, where it apparently has become the best city in the world. Because during the last 10 years, 15 years, it's again and again been hailed as the best city in the world, or one of the best cities in the world.
Yeah.
And I didn't really agree with this notion of Copenhagen being the best city in the world, because I really liked how the Copenhagen was in the 90s, because it was much more inclusive, it was much more diverse than it is today. And also, I've been struggling for many years to gain a foothold on the real estate market of Copenhagen, you can say, or just the rental market. So for many years, because I lived 7 years in Berlin and I was out of the Copenhagen real estate market, I had to gain access again. And I just saw the city from without, you can say. You know, if everyone is hailing Copenhagen and it's a great party to live there, if you cannot gain access to this party, the party is not so nice. So,
right, the real estate prices have just gone atmospheric, really.
Yes.
So you have to be quite wealthy to live in town.
You have to be quite wealthy, or you have to be very lucky, or you have to have had the luck of moving there in the 70s or 80s or 90s, or you have to have wealthy parents.
Ah, yes.
Which, of course, some people do.
And we're seeing this certainly all over America, in American cities. In the biggest town near me, Raleigh, North Carolina, real estate prices have just doubled, really, over the last 5-7 years. It's part of a worldwide phenomenon for certain places.
Yes.
How does a city deal with that?
Well, Copenhagen is not really dealing with it. Copenhagen is harvesting it.
Okay.
So, in order to finance infrastructure and in order to finance all the amenities that people want today, the bike lanes, the incredible parks for kids, the metro system, not least. The metro system is financed by real estate sales. So, selling
Taxes,
off,
yes.
selling off a land for investors to build on. That's what Copenhagen is doing. And they try, of course, to sell as expensive as possible to finance all these things, all these amenities. But I think, of course, cities can do that in different ways. And I know, of course, of cities that are questioning how expensive they should sell their lots and how expensive development should be and how expensive rent should be in the end. So Rotterdam could be an example of that. They're at least trying to do mixing when it comes to social housing and expensive housing and so on and so forth. And Vienna is also still an example of that. But if you have one or two or three cities that are keeping prices down among an ocean of very, very expensive cities, these cities will, of course, be very attractive. The cheap cities will be very attractive, and people will want to move there. And this will also cause these cities to become either expensive or exclusive. Just like Christiania, which you mentioned, it's a very nice, you can live there, but no one can gain access because the place is full.
Right.
Yeah.
And very limited new things come on the market.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
What did you discover about other cities that were doing a better job with social housing and a diversity in community?
Well, I could have looked more into this with my film. I decided not to. I decided to just solely focus on Copenhagen, but that could, of course, have been a thing to do. But I think in general, you can say there are not many cities that are doing a very good job at this. Vienna is an example. Maybe Rotterdam is working on it, but most cities are having great difficulties with this. It's a worldwide problem. And also, either they're going the neoliberal way, willingly, or they're just simply challenged.
Okay.
Because there is so much money going into real estate. There's so much money going into city investments. And so, it's a way also for people to park their money. As we're seeing here in America, it's the first time I'm in New York for 13 years, and I noticed today these very slim towers.
The super talls, they're called.
Super tall, which is just air where money has been parked, as far as I've heard.
Yeah, people typically do not live in these units.
Exactly.
They've just bought $20 or $30 or $50 million worth of space that they're hoping will appreciate over time.
Yeah.
So now it's not a residence; it's an investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
In making your film, what did you discover about the answer to this dilemma? Are there things that Copenhagen could do at this point in its own real estate land rush?
Well, I mean, Copenhagen could start selling land at a cheaper rate, but of course that would simply be giving money to the investors.
Okay.
Because they could then just sell the land the next day for double the price. So, of course, if you do that, it should come with limitations, and it should also come with, demands for what should be built and for whom. But maybe it could also be an idea not to sell the land, but to lease the land for 30 years or 50 years or 99 years, as they do in other cities, so that land can never be bought infinitely by someone.
Right.
That could be a thing to do. And, of course, Copenhagen could also decide to maybe finance less metro or put a halt to certain investments to instead focus on building cheaper apartments or have cheaper apartments built. But I think, what's nice at least is that everyone is now talking about it, and everyone pretty much is aware of it. In every city, these debates are going on. So I think hopefully this at least will lead to changes occurring.
When I looked up about Copenhagen online, one of the things that I saw was that one of the reasons why it's acclaimed as a number one city all the time is it seems to do pretty well as far as creating low-cost housing. There's still not enough, but they are building it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, they're building it, but it's not cheap.
It's not cheap.
It's not cheap, no. It might be a little cheaper than real estate, or whatever.
Market rate kind of prices?
Kind of houses, but not that much anymore. So, but I mean, in comparison maybe to other cities where the developments are more extreme, you could get that impression of Copenhagen. I don't know, but I really don't think Copenhagen is doing a very good job. But what they're starting also to do is to differentiate when they build. So they are building smaller apartments now. For many years, they weren't building one-room apartments, weren't building any two-room apartments. So it was always larger size apartments because that was the standard. They were thinking, well, that's a basic human right to have 90 square meters and 3 rooms. But now they're realizing most people who live in the city are singles. They don't need that much amount of space, So slowly things are changing, maybe for the better.
And Copenhagen, like almost all large cities, also experiencing a huge influx of migrants and having to house those migrants. How are they dealing with that situation?
Well, not really. We're not seeing that many migrants. Denmark is very restrictive when it comes to migrants moving to the country and refugees. We're not really seeing that, I must say. And if we have them, they go to the suburbs.
Okay.
They go to like the big modernist housing estates of the 60s and 70s, and that's where they live, either within Copenhagen or just outside Copenhagen.
Because I'm a big fan of Danish TV, and the Danish TV shows I see always portray it as if there are lots of immigrants coming in all the time, and they're having to deal with that. So this is interesting to hear that it's not quite what I'm seeing on TV.
Yeah, exactly. It's a political theme, it fills a lot in people's heads, but in reality there's not much of it. So it could be a lot more, and in comparison with New York, New Yorkers would say, diversity, you don't have any diversity in the city of Copenhagen anymore. It used to be more. Yeah, there are still a few neighborhoods where you'll find something that resembles maybe what you could call Berlin or Rotterdam or Copenhagen, but it's very limited.
What do you want people to come away from after watching the film?
Well, I want, people to look critically at just the current developments we're seeing, and to initiate these debates about what is best, what is really best practice today? What do we need for us to be able to truly speak about best practice? Best is not just about bike lanes and attractive parks and this and that, but it's also really a social agenda that cities need to house all sorts of people coming from all sorts of backgrounds, colors, and so on and so forth, cultures. So that's what I'm hoping for.
I mean, America is constantly sending delegations to Copenhagen to see how they do things. And if they're not doing it as well as we think, what hope is there for us, right?
Yeah, sure. No, I think, of course, Copenhagen, I must also say, is a very nice city, and many things are really functioning very well. If you take your bike and drive through the city, it's incredible what you can experience. But Copenhagen is also just a medium-sized city. So the question is if you can really take Copenhagen as a model for instance, a city like New York. I don't think so. These cities that are often categorized as the best cities in the world are often medium-sized cities in Northern Europe.
They're not the supersized cities.
They're not the supersized cities,
Because there's just too much to manage in these large cities.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, here in New York, we can't even get the subway line to go out to the airport because of all the politics in the last 100 years.
Yeah. So I think that's of course one thing to consider. The other thing is, of course, the Danish welfare state system, which has been in place for at least 100 years. That's one of the reasons also why Copenhagen is functioning so well, I think.
Okay. Now, after the film goes through different festivals, where can people see it? Where do you plan to have it available?
Well, eventually it'll probably just be Vimeo on demand, I think.
Okay.
I could imagine.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for talking to me about the film. This is wonderful.
Well, thank you for having me.
When I landed at UNC Chapel Hill as an undergraduate, eons ago, one name came up over and over on posters around campus. Come see Jim Ketch and the UNC Jazz Band. Jim took the university and the town by storm in the mid-'70s, and for 43 years inspired students, faculty, and the public as trumpet professor and director of jazz studies. He has performed for shows over a 6-decade career with Aretha Franklin, The Temptations, The Four Tops, Natalie Cole, Ben E. King, The Manhattan Transfer, John Pizzarelli, and Renee Marie. He shared the stage with jazz luminaries, including Marcus Roberts, Byron Stripling, Tom Harrell, Slide Hampton, Ron Westray, Steve Wilson, and Terry Lynn Carrington. He released 2 personal albums, 3 more with the North Carolina Jazz Repertory Orchestra, which he directs, and has been part of countless more.
Going strong in what he calls retirement, and there's quotes around that, Jim teaches privately, plays and teaches in high school, college, and professional music programs, and judges jazz contests and festivals. He plays regularly at our favorite local jazz club, Sharp 9, with both the North Carolina Jazz Repertory Orchestra and the Jim Ketch Swing Tet, featuring past podcast guest Mark Wells from Peter Lamb and the Wolves. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Jim, when you landed at UNC, you were just kind of an immediate rock star, so to speak. I mean, all those posters around campus, was that part of a strategy just to expand the awareness? Because I saw them everywhere.
Well, I'm glad you did see those everywhere. I'm not exactly sure. That's a lot of years to think back, but I do remember that I wanted the students to have a following, and I guess we were all energetic enough to say, all right, everybody take 10 posters and put them up somewhere on your way to class. I think that was probably my admonition to them was, if you get a chance to make an announcement in your class, invite students to come tonight.
Well, it worked. I mean, that kind of guerrilla marketing.
Guerrilla marketing, that's perfect.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
It just put the jazz scene on the map at the time, and you had all different kind of configurations, which you continue to do. Tell me about the different size groups that you've been working with.
Well, the typical program at a college is you will have a jazz orchestra, which is usually about an 18-piece group, trumpets, trombones, a saxophone section, a rhythm section, maybe a vocalist. But early on, you realize that if these young people are going to learn how to improvise, you also need to give them some opportunities to play in small groups. So depending on how many rhythm sections we could put together, we might have 3 or 4 combos as well.
Was there one year in particular that was a winning year for the jazz orchestra?
Well,
like winning a bowl game in football?
Well, we don't do as much in the competitive nature. And I learned early on, because I would say, hey, we got to go out and tour the state. We've got to go out and play. That a lot of students saying, I have a chemistry exam at the end of this week. I have a biology paper due, or whatever the case may be. And I realized that, they were certainly eager musicians, but they were also dedicated to their academic studies outside of music. And UNC was obviously a venerable place to have a double major, the liberal arts capital of the world, so to speak. And so I learned early on that I had to give them plenty of advance notice.
And I guess the basketball players filled up summer school.
You know what? I had quite a few athletes in classes over the years.
Really?
Yeah,
Cool.
I did.
Did anybody go on to both basketball and music fame?
Well, the best example I can give you, and I wouldn't have thought about this if you hadn't spurred me on with this question, but one of the assistant coaches during the Dean Smith era and the Roy Williams as assistant coach era was Randy Wheel. Mm-hmm. And he was quite a good jazz guitarist. And he took a jazz improvisation course that I offered and even let me come down and shoot around hoops at the Dean Dome a few times. And I think he went on to maybe be the head coach at maybe Middle Tennessee State or Murray State. It was a Tennessee
organization.
Sort of mid-major type of program. Yeah. He was the nicest guy in the world and had a nice hollow body guitar. I mean, he really had the right sound for the music. So I sort of used that, it was almost like he was my teaching assistant. I could ask him to demonstrate things or whatever, and I knew it would sound like a jazz player was playing it.
Now, before you retired, the pandemic hit, and I understand that you had some challenges teaching over Zoom.
Well, that's for certain. That spring semester of, I guess, 2020, we usually held a jazz festival in mid to late February, and that's the last sort of live program I did. I had Steve Wilson, a great saxophonist who plays first saxophone with Maria Schneider's big band, and Dave Stryker, a very notable guitarist, were my guest artists. And fortunately, we got to do that entire weekend. But then within about 10 days, it was spring break. And about then, the word was getting out that, we've got to be very cautious here. And the chancellor basically said, don't come back from spring break. We will have to finish our teaching remotely. Now, I'm blessed with the sense that semester I was basically just teaching what I would call my applied duties, directing the jazz band, coaching a couple combos, teaching, 10 or 12 trumpet lessons, and those things we would do over line and do, little projects, and students would submit things back and forth, and very unsatisfying, I must say.
Yeah.
And I had already announced that I was retiring. So I felt like I retired with a limp, so to speak. I didn't get to do my last concert. I was going to bring a former Chapel Hillian who was a professor of jazz studies at the University of Louisville named Gabe Evans, very gifted pianist and arranger. He was going to be my final guest artist in April. We didn't get to do that concert.
Everything canceled.
Everything got canceled. But about a year and a half later, about 100 students, we did sort of a reunion, farewell for me and reunion.
Oh, good.
And had about 100 students, literally from some of them in my first jazz bands in the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Came back. And it was, my cup overfloweth, if you will. It was just great, and I felt like there's the closure.
What was this event called? Catch of the Day?
Well, it should have been, I suppose. I talked to students. I said, I don't want to just come back and sit around the table and, eat and drink, although those things are fun too. I said, how many of you are up for playing? And everybody said, absolutely. So we did a small group night on Friday, and first the current faculty, and me played and opened up. Then we had some of the combos came intact from, let's say, 2003 to 2005. They said, we're all coming. Can we play as our own group? So that was very rewarding. And then the next day we had a rehearsal, and we did a big band concert and played 8 or 10 tunes, I can't remember. But I said, wow, if I could have all this horsepower to draw from, I'd have a pretty good program, because many of them had gone on and, done some nice things and were teaching jazz studies at different universities and things of that nature. So anyway, that was a nice closure.
Let's hear Jim. This is called Without a Song. That is real mastery right there.
Yeah, Jim, what group is that? Is that your own combo?
Yes.
And what are you playing?
Well, I'm the trumpeter on that recording. It's just a duo with my colleague Steve Anderson.
Oh, really?
We did a quintet recording, and at the end of one of the sessions before we were going to take a break, Steve and I had talked about maybe trying a couple duos, and that was one of them. And later on in that CD, at the very end of that recording session, I remember Steve Haynes, who's a wonderful bass player and is professor of music at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, who was also on the date. I said, "Hey, Steve, let's try Shiny Stockings." I mean, everybody was packing up, and we just decided, to try one more, and we put that on the CD as well. Duo playing is just so intimate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just a lovely setting to try to play it. It was fun to listen to that. I had not listened to that in a while, and I sort of have a lyrical sort of nature to my playing, and Steve is hot and percussive, and I said it almost feels like the day Chet Baker and Chick Corea walked into the studio together and recorded a tune. It's kind of nice to hear that contrast and good sense of openness of the time. Everything felt very comfortable.
I'm glad we could help.
Yeah, thank you all. That was a nice treat for me.
Now, Michael Jordan, famous UNC basketball player, to my knowledge, never played for Duke. But you have also played for Duke in the medical orchestra. So how is it to be a dual citizen?
The medical orchestra?
Well, actually, there was a while where I was the trumpet teacher at Duke University as well. In fact, I did a semester sabbatical just last spring, I guess, for Duke while someone was away. So, in music, we don't carry that Hatfield and McCoy's quite to the extent that we do in sports. I guess we're not religious enough.
I mean, what's next, Jim? Clemson?
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm going to draw my line, we'll see on all that. So the Duke Medical Orchestra, I'm really not a member of that, but what happened was that they contacted me and said, we are doing an ambitious program that includes the First Symphony of Gustav Mahler. And I'm thinking an amateur orchestra attempting Mahler is quite an undertaking. And they said, would you do a sectional with our brass players? And I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, it goes without saying probably that, doctors, nurses, whatever, many of them are very aficionados of classical music. And lo and behold, many of them played instruments and played them quite well. So I just had a fun 2 hours working with all the brass players on some of the meaty brass material that's found in any Mahler symphony.
Jim, what's your medical specialty that qualifies you to be in the Duke Medical Orchestra?
I know. Well,
he's a trumpetarian.
I guess it shows you that anybody can be a conductor.
or a doctor.
Or a doctor, maybe. They didn't call security on me, so that was good.
Good.
Jim, one of the really cool things you did in your career was creating the North Carolina Jazz Festival for high school students.
Yeah.
In 1977, which is still going strong. Tell me about that.
Well, I think I was all of 25 years of age when I came to Carolina. I felt like, well, if I'm going to do something with this program, I need to know the schools in the state and the directors and, where are the hotbeds of talent and so on and so forth.
And where were the hotbeds of talent in 1977 in North Carolina?
There was a couple. There was actually a nice program in Rocky Mount. At that time. They had a wham bang of a marching band and were very competitive and would go to contests and all that. But fortunately, the director also liked jazz, and we became friends pretty early on. And I made quite a few trips early in the morning to be at Rocky Mount by 9 a.m. or whenever they had their rehearsal. And I chuckle because most directors don't have a lot of experience with improvisation, and that's the thing. If I could just get my kids to be able to improvise, I've got the horsepower for all the written parts, but it's that improvised section. And I remember he'd say, well, Jim, you got 90 minutes. I want you to teach them all to ad lib. And I said, I can do that in 20 minutes.
Right. Name that tune.
But anyway, the festival was, kind of started on a shoestring. There was no budget for it. I had no budget. So I basically called a friend, Jamie Abersold, who's sort of like the Dean Smith of jazz education. And I said, I want to have a festival. I want to have a guest artist. I'd like for you to come down. You'd play with my jazz band. You'd work with the kids. and I can probably put together $600. And he said, well, I'm a clinician for Selmer saxophones. Let's write them a letter, see if they'll help a little bit.
Yeah.
Off we went, and it started in 77, and we kept it going. And somewhere in the mid-90s, one of the South Building administrators, his son was in my jazz improvisation class, so he sort of became aware of how hard we were working to try to make a difference in the state in jazz. And he said, you got a great product that nobody knows about. And then he got other entities together, and the budget sort of exploded.
Yeah.
And my goodness, we had McCoy Tyner, Ahmad Jamal.
Wow.
Carol Sloan, Al Gray from the Count Basie Orchestra. Just the sort of level of marquee artist I could bring to the students. And that attracted students. All of a sudden, it's like here's a tenor saxophonist from New Jersey who, I want to study economics, but I'd also like to do music. And, they found a home at UNC.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. It's a real service to the supply chain of great musicians throughout the South. This next song from Jim is called Short Story. I've been playing that song at home a lot lately because it reminds me of those 1970s private detective shows.
Yeah.
Right? Like
does.
Mannix and Cannon
It's
and
noir.
Barnaby Jones. Yeah.
Well, there's probably a reason why you would do that association. A lot of those shows, the music director was Quincy Jones or Oliver Nelson or Benny Golson. The greats were writing for those. I think Ironsides
Yes, right.
was Quincy Jones.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, that was great stuff. And the cream of the West Coast musicians playing it.
Yeah. You can reach Jim at jimketch.com and hear more of his music. Jim, thanks so much for joining us today.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle Square Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Malibu, Toronto, Los Angeles, and Palm Springs.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli handles guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.